Let's bring in Dr. Alon Burstein. Alon, as always, good to see you. There's a lot to get to, as always. A live look at Gaza. It's a Thursday morning there. I know you saw this recently. The Wall Street Journal had an exclusive, and the FDD was reporting on this as well. They're reporting about what motivated Hamas to carry out the October 7th attack. The Journal says then Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar wanted to torpedo peace negotiations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. They found this information, I should mention, in a tunnel underground. What more context, Alon, do you feel is worth adding to a report like this? Hamas's motive is something that you and I have discussed several times since the war started.
It's good to see you, Austin. The question about what was Hamas's motivation, and specifically the link to torpedoing the normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, is one that everyone started asking immediately after the October 7th attack. These documents specifically show that torpedoing the Saudi deal, or the normalization deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia, was on Hamas's radar. It does not say in any way anything like this was the main objective of October 7th, or this is why October 7th was carried out. It's important to remember that even within these documents, Hamas is talking about a plan that it has been developing for 2 years. The October 7th attack was under construction at least for 2 years in its current form, and there's a lot of evidence that actually Hamas had been building a different type of plan already a year before that, since 2020. So at that time, this is before the Abraham Accords, let alone before negotiations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. So it's wrong to think that the sole purpose of October 7th was to derail the Saudi deal. Similarly, the initial plans for October 7th were supposed to be carried out 6 months earlier. They're supposed to be carried out on the eve of Passover of 2023. In the end, the IDF had moved some additional tank divisions to the border with Gaza on the eve of Passover. Hamas thought that the IDF was onto its plan and decided to postpone. All that being said, it does not mean that torpedoing the Saudi deal was not also on the agenda. Hamas was trying to think, what are we going to do, given that Israel is in advanced negotiations at that point with Saudi Arabia? And executing this plan was also intended to torpedo that deal. It's very important to understand that Saudi Arabia is a key actor in the global Islamic idea, in the global Islamic world, specifically in the Sunni world. If Israel would normalize relations with Saudi Arabia, it doesn't mean that the entire Islamic world would all of a sudden make peace with Israel, but it does mean that the legitimacy of carrying on a global jihad, or in the Palestinian Hamas case, a local jihad against Israel in the name of Sunni Islam, that idea would be vastly crippled. So Hamas wanted to disrupt the normalization talks with Saudi Arabia. It largely succeeded. Maybe now there will be some way of that advancing, but so far it's largely succeeded. But it's also wrong to think, as I think that article sort of overplayed, that this was the main objective of October 7th. I think that that's overreaching.
Let's put it this way. Did Hamas accomplish what it wanted to if we look back to October 7th, 2023?
That's a big question. We're on the 600th day of the war. It's a big question. Some would argue yes, because Hamas did manage to torpedo the Saudi deal, which was on the agenda. One of the things that it also said it wanted was to bring the Palestinian issue back onto the arena. It had been completely sidelined. It is now front and center on the international arena. It did manage to bolster its position as a local player, even if the current negotiations possibly have Hamas no longer being a governing structure in the Gaza Strip. It is not going anywhere. To large extents, it did manage to achieve a lot of the ideological ideas that it wanted to achieve, in the sense of saying Hamas is here, it's not just going to disappear into the background. Violent resistance against Israel is the method of Hamas, that is the method of one of the Palestinian factions. And in large ways, it did succeed. Of course, if we look at the results in the Gaza Strip, if we look at the condition of Hamas right now, it is a hard sell to say that they are in a stronger position than they were prior to October 7th. Then they were governing the Gaza Strip. Now, they're certainly not defeated, but they're also not in any governing position. The big miscalculation that Hamas did with October 7th is they fully expected Hezbollah and Iraqi militias and Syrian militias to all throw their weight into the war the moment they launched the war. This is shown also in internal documents. that were found within the Gaza Strip. Hamas thought once we launch the war, everyone's going to throw their weight into the war. And then that doesn't mean that Israel will be defeated militarily. But then Israel would possibly be forced to negotiate with all the different actors because they couldn't withstand the war for that long, for so much time. If Hezbollah had managed to, for example, raid into the northern parts of Israel the same way Hamas raided into the south, they done that a day later, Israel would not have been in the position to throw all its weight into the Gaza Strip and would have had to come to some sort of deal. Hamas was more depending on that, and that is really its big miscalculation. So it achieved part of maybe the larger ideas of putting the Palestinian issue back on the map and putting itself in the position of saying its ideas of resisting Israel militarily are not going anywhere. In terms of the actual victory that it would like to have in the Gaza Strip, it's hard to say right now, but the war is not over, so remains to be seen, obviously.
Could Hamas, and you touched on this a little bit, if you can expand, could Hamas have imagined the IDF's response to this October 7th, 2023 attack? We're looking at some of the destruction in Gaza. This was taken months and months ago. But Alon, could Hamas have imagined this type of response, a response that continues to this day?
So it's hard to say that Hamas would have imagined this type of response. This is an unprecedented response on any international level when it comes to counterterrorism strategies and asymmetrical warfare. And certainly in the Israeli-Palestinian arena, the last year and a half has caused more death and carnage than basically the entire Israeli-Palestinian conflict combined for the last 70, 80, 100 years, depending on when you start counting it. So certainly Hamas didn't necessarily see that it would be to this extent. At the same time, it's also important to note that the October 7th attack is also unprecedented on the international arena by any measure. It is the largest terror attack in history on almost all measures, on the measures of the amount of weaponry that was used, the amount of attackers that were used, the amount of hostages taken, the extent and time that it took. It is only beaten by 9/11 by the amount of casualties that happened on that day. But to some extent, that also was a game changer. So the rules of the game broke, so to speak, on October 7th when Hamas launched that attack. And it's to some extent not surprising that then the IDF and Israel broke the rules of the game in return in the Gaza Strip. What Hamas didn't foresee probably is, first of all, that, again, Hezbollah would not throw its weight into the war and Israel would not be nearly as distracted as it wanted to be. That's fact number one. Fact number two, I don't think Hamas foresaw the extent of international support that Israel would get, the legitimacy that Israel got at the beginning of the war. Remember Biden coming and hugging Israel, that train of diplomats and state leaders coming, giving Israel all the support that it needed and again bolstering it to launch this massive offensive. I don't think Hamas anticipated that. I think that they didn't quite realize the extent of damage that it would do, the fact that they recorded themselves the October 7th attack. This was used for propaganda purposes, but it's sort of an interesting development. A few weeks after the attack, they started to quickly take down those videos from their websites because they realized actually this is really damaging to our view as the victims of Israeli aggression. I don't think they anticipated that. And I don't think that they anticipated that the Israeli public would be as scarred from what happened on October 7th to continuously support a war that at this point has no end game in sight, but nonetheless, the Israeli public is still, at least some people are protesting against it, but by and large, the government is still relatively stable, which is quite a surprise. I don't think that they anticipated those facets. They certainly would have anticipated a very harsh response. I don't think they anticipated such a long response. One last thing I'll say that's also important to note that October 7th, to some extent, succeeded far beyond what Hamas anticipated. According to the different documents that were caught within Hamas's offices in the Gaza Strip, Hamas expected that Israel knows about the attack. It thought Israel's all-encompassing intelligence. It must know about the attack. Hamas thought that only a few of its units, it sent over 80 units to burst holes in the fence. Only several, maybe dozen, maybe less of its units would manage to get through. And their plan for the attack was quite different. The plan for the attack was for those units to take over a couple of Israeli kibbutzim or towns in the area and hold the people there hostage for a few days and negotiate from that point of view, from that perspective. Obviously, they probably foresaw that Israel would meanwhile bomb Gaza and things would develop, but the fact that the Israeli defense system completely collapsed and virtually every single Hamas unit managed to get through the fence and kidnap everyone they saw and kill everyone they saw, is something that even Hamas did not anticipate the success of October 7th to that level, and therefore the reaction also probably something they couldn't have foreseen as much.
A live look at Tel Aviv, 5:43 in the morning there. Israel has said that its two main objectives in this war are to rescue the hostages and to eliminate Hamas. We'll talk about the hostages in a moment. Alon, how much progress has Israel made in eliminating Hamas? And is eliminating Hamas and eliminating the idea of Hamas a different thing? Is eliminating the ideas of Hamas even possible?
Eliminating an idea is never possible. I'm going to compare this. It's not a fair comparison, but I'm going to compare it to some extent. If we look at, just because this is a comparison that I heard recently in a lecture, I thought it was interesting. If we look at the Civil War in the United States, eliminate the idea of slavery. You can't really eliminate an idea. You can stop something from happening, but that's like saying racism won't exist anymore. That said, you could stop slavery from happening. Similarly, can you eliminate Hamas's idea? No. Could you stop Hamas from having governing capabilities in the Gaza Strip and being in the position to possibly implement its ideas? Yes, you could. So you can't eliminate the idea, but you can eliminate some of the mechanisms that are in place that may allow it to actually succeed. Defeating Hamas in the sense that no one who believes in a Hamas ideology or no one who ever carried a weapon for Hamas is defeated or surrendered. No, that's not realistic. That's not feasible. That's never happened anywhere internationally. There's never been a case where a terror group has completely been destroyed and everyone who ever believed in that idea or wanted to fight for that idea has been killed or arrested. But you have had situations where groups have been weakened by repression, by counterterrorism, by essentially militaries coming in and fighting them. And then if you have another mechanism put into place, a different government in this case, or possibly different governing mechanisms or policies or whatever happens, again, depends on the context, you have situations where the idea that was behind that terror group sort of loses favor and becomes much smaller. So that's in terms of, can Hamas be defeated? Now, in terms of militarily, how much has Israel advanced? There was a report of the IDF that was published just a few days ago on May 25th that was quite damning to Israel's case that it is making advances. On the one hand, we are now well over a year since Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu said we are a hair's breadth away from victory. If we just go into Rafah, we will have total victory. That's when he started using that term, total victory. And Israel's been fighting this war now 19, 20 months, according to the IDF report that was issued 3 days ago. First of all, Hamas is weakened morally or like in terms of morale on the one hand. On the other hand, the group has managed over the war to completely replenish its fighting forces. According to the IDF intelligence, Hamas currently has some 40,000 Al-Qassam fighters ready to fight. That is the same number that the group had when the war broke out. That means that if the IDF has managed to kill, give or take 17,000, 18,000, according to the numbers that the IDF is publishing, if they have managed to kill those many terror operatives, just as many have been recruited throughout the war. That's pretty damning to the case that the war is succeeding in destroying Hamas militarily. Similarly, within that IDF report, it also said that Hamas, according to the estimates of the IDF, still has between several dozen and several hundred long-range rockets that can target anywhere in Israel, and several hundred to several thousand short-range rockets and mortars that can do a lot of damage to the areas around the Gaza Strip. These are all in underground tunnels. These are in warehouses the IDF has not managed to get to. Again, that is pretty damning. Does this mean that Hamas is just as strong as it was on October 7th? Absolutely not. The organizational structure of Hamas has largely collapsed. Most of its leaders in the Gaza Strip have been assassinated. We have these new recruits certainly are not as well trained. They're not ideologically indoctrinated. That said, the war isn't going anywhere as far as Hamas is concerned right now. Hamas is still in the position to put up a fight against Israel. That is one of the reasons that Israel is now building up to this big operation, but it is not actually throwing all its weight in yet. It's waiting to see, will a deal be brokered? Summarizing what I'm saying in response to your question, could Hamas be defeated? Yes, militarily. Is it actually close to that? According to the IDF report just from a few days ago, not that close at this point.
Let's talk about the hostages. They've been in captivity for 600 days alone. What conditions are the hostages likely living in? What have we learned from others that have been released?
So just to first of all talk a little bit about the numbers, there are 58 hostages still in the Gaza Strip. Of them, 20 are considered alive. This is either life signs from Hamas videos and Palestinian Islamic Jihad videos that have been shown, or from testimony of hostages that were released that said that they can verify those hostages are still alive. Those are 20. 35 of them are confirmed dead by the IDF. Some of them were killed, most of them were killed on October 7th, and their bodies were kidnapped back to the Gaza Strip. And some of them were killed during the war. And then 3 more are, I'm just, for the sake of time, going to say are very likely dead. I'm not going to get into the specifics of why I'm saying that they're very likely dead but not dead. That's according to what Israel has published. So right now, likely 20 are alive, 3 likely dead but unclear, and 35 still are dead. In terms of their condition is very, very harsh. We know this, first of all, from the testimony of the hostages that have returned. Most of the hostages that still remain in captivity were either IDF soldiers that were kidnapped while still part of the military, or they are young men which Hamas considers still soldiers because they are within the age range that can be drafted within Israel. That means that their conditions that they are held in and the treatment that they receive is a lot harsher than the civilians that were held. Civilians that were held were in terrible condition. But according to the testimony of hostages that have been released, these soldiers that were kidnapped have been, I'm not going to get into specifics, but have been vastly abused and suffered torture, suffered interrogation. They are held in underground tunnels, some of them held in chains, some of them are sick. There's at least one that we know of that has severe muscle sickness. One of them lost an eye in the October 7th attack, and according to testimony of hostages, is in the process of losing his vision in the tunnels. I don't want to get into specifics because it's very harsh descriptions. The situation is extremely dire for the hostages. The last thing I'll say, some of the hostages' testimonies in the last several days, hostages that were released, have said that as the IDF progressed towards the areas that they were held in, their treatment was progressively worse. Often their captors who were guarding them had friends who had been killed, had family members who had been killed. All of a sudden they were beaten. All of a sudden there were a lot of things. So that is also sort of hovering over in the minds of people as the IDF might be advancing into further areas in Gaza. What's going to be with the hostages?
So, Tel Aviv. Family members of hostages gathered in Tel Aviv today. They were directing angry comments at the Israeli government. Alon, can you describe the complex dynamic of how the Israeli public has digested this war? How has Israeli public support of the war moved over 600 days? And how important of a factor is public support in determining how Israel handles the war in the future?
There's a lot of facets to that. As someone who studies Israeli politics, so I'll try to be brief. Broadly speaking, when the October 7th attack happened, it was a shock to the entire political system in Israel. And there was overwhelming support. In surveys, 70, 80% of the population supported military strikes, harsh responses against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, against Hamas, but also broadly against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. There was concern for the hostages, but this concern was often overshadowed by anger and rage and things like that. This changed over the course of the war as a result of several different things. There's several critical junctures that started to shift in terms of Israeli public opinion. Among others, there were hostages that were killed by the IDF. Some of these, Hamas said they were killed. Some of these other hostages who were released said that their friends had been killed in IDF bombings. There were 3 hostages that were gunned down after they managed to escape in Gaza, but the IDF gunned them down, even though they're waving white flag, thinking that they were Palestinians. A lot of this started to shift public opinion against what the IDF is doing and the aims of the war. If the aims of the war were to return the hostages and defeat Hamas, well, more hostages were being killed by the IDF than were being rescued. So that started to shift public opinion. Then there were the different junctures that happened when it seemed like there were possible deals supported by the United States under the Biden administration and the Trump administration, in which there might be an alternative mechanism to just continuing the fighting. There might be an avenue where a different governing body, maybe the Palestinian Authority after it undergoes deep reforms, maybe an Arab entity like Egypt or the United Arab Emirates would take responsibility for Gaza, and through the framework of a deal, the hostages would be released, And at the same time, there would be a changing of the guard. Hamas would be either disarmed or go into exile. The deals were on the table, and Israel rejected them. Now, Hamas rejected a lot of the deals too. I'm not saying that Israel is the only one who rejected deals. But in terms of Israeli public opinion, where the opinion started to turn more against the war is when those deals were rejected, and seemingly over time it became clear that this is being done as a result of political considerations. Netanyahu's government will not be able to withstand stopping the war. He is dependent for his coalition on the parties led by Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich. They have openly said that they will leave the government and overthrow the government if the war is stopped. And over time, the fact that this became more and more of a political game, and that Israel was seen within the Israeli public as, on the one hand, trying to fight Hamas, but at the same time not actually doing what it can do to bring the hostages back, is really where we started to see the tides turning over time.
Alon, if you will, stand by for 2 minutes. We do have to take a commercial break, but I've got a few more questions for you, and our audience does as well. We'll be showing some of these audience questions and a couple more after we do have to take one break before the hour ends. So let's take that break, Alon, and then we'll be back to wrap up the interview in 2 minutes. Okay, so we're back. Alon Burstein is still here as well. There's just too much to talk about. We couldn't contain it all in one segment alone. One incredibly important facet that you and I like to discuss as often as possible is the developing humanitarian situation within Gaza. You and I have been discussing in recent weeks specifically some of the challenges with even getting aid to the people that need it most. Do we have any updates?
There's been a lot of developments on that in the last week. After aid was cut off to the Gaza Strip, there was continuous stream of aid to various different levels and really varied from 20 trucks a day to 600 trucks a day, starting in October 20th of 2023 until essentially March of this year. March 2nd of 2025 is the first time since the war began that Israel completely cut off all humanitarian aid coming into the Gaza Strip. And then for 2.5 months, there was no aid that came in. And that's really where we've seen the bulk of international pressure come down on Israel, trying to say, okay, other than starving out the population, you say you're starving Hamas, but that Hamas has stolen the aid in the past, so it's not suffering. So what is happening? That's been the bulk of the pressure over the last weeks. And really this week, we had the first major development with the initiation of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. This is a foundation that was announced by Steve Witkoff, actually, the special U.S. envoy to the region, several weeks ago. And this foundation is doing something slightly different. Its aim is to set up secure locations in the Gaza Strip and say that Palestinians will come to those centers, representative of families, and receive aid packages. This is very different than the mechanism until now. Until now, aid trucks, and as we were always counting how many aid trucks came in, aid trucks would come into the Gaza Strip, and then the United Nations would distribute them throughout the entire Gaza Strip to the different stores, the different bakeries. But the result is that the trucks were very vulnerable. They were often hijacked by Hamas. They were often looted by Palestinians who were desperate for aid. This is different. This is a situation where the IDF is protecting specific areas and protecting the trucks from being looted, and Palestinians have to come to those areas to receive aid. On the one hand, the initiation of that started 2 days ago with 2 different centers, both in the southern parts of the Gaza Strip. The initiation of that is seen as, a very welcome development. You can see in the pictures, Palestinians who have been starving are all of a sudden receiving food packages. This is something that Israel has boasted is going to be a game changer. Hamas will not be able to take over the aid, and Palestinians are going to receive aid, and therefore the situation can be alleviated without endangering Israel's war aims, on the one hand. On the other hand, there's also a lot of international criticism of this mechanism because it is also encompassed within it several different things. One, it is to some extent forcing Palestinians to relocate. Palestinians now in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip do not have access to aid. And there's no pretense that aid trucks are going to go to the Gaza to the north. They are going to have to travel south. These aid packages are good, according to the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, for 3.5 days, give or take. They're supposed to feed a family of 5.5 individuals. That means people have to continuously come back to them. And some have speculated that this is part of a larger Israeli plan, actually, to draw the Palestinian population out of the northern parts of the Gaza Strip to evacuate the northern parts of the Gaza Strip. And that not only is not the stated aims of the foundation, it is also unto itself an international war crime. You're not allowed to use hunger as a way to affect your methods of war. So there's a lot of international criticism of this on the one hand. On the other hand, there's also the fact that for the first time in the last several days, several thousand aid packages have been distributed, amounting to several 100,000 meals coming to starving Palestinians. And a lot of people who are critical of the criticism are saying, okay, you're saying this isn't a perfect mechanism. You're right, but people were starving. Now less people are starving. You should be welcoming this. So that's the development right now that's happening. 2 centers have been opened in the last several days. According to the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, 2 more are expected to open. One of them will be further north in central Gaza. We'll see how this develops and what exactly happens. I will say Hamas is pressured by this. Hamas has been calling on Palestinians to not go to those aid centers, calling this an Israeli trick. That unto itself says something about the fact that Hamas is scared that the Palestinians may become less dependent on it, which is also indicating to some extent that these centers may be somewhat of a success in alleviating the pressures of the population.
We asked the viewers to send in their questions. JT, asking about the aid, he's in Redlands. He asks, why isn't there more international pressure on Hamas to allow humanitarian aid and food into Gaza and prohibit Hamas from usurping or taking the aid? There's been a lot of people talking about the pressures on Israel to get aid in, but let's talk about the Hamas piece of this, Alon.
So the Hamas piece certainly needs to be talked about. One of the things that happened today is Palestinians looted a warehouse that was guarded by Hamas that apparently had, several tons of flour that the group had stockpiled, stolen from the aid over the last several months before aid was cut off. So Hamas has access to humanitarian aid and to food that it was not giving the population. It was selling to the population or keeping for its own fighters. So this is certainly a piece of the puzzle. And why is there more international pressure on Hamas? So there are several different answers to that. First of all, Hamas is defined as a terror group. It's defined as a terror group by the majority of the international community, by Israel, the United States, the EU, also the United Nations. This causes complications. First of all, none of those bodies legally are supposed to talk to Hamas or negotiate with it. Now, obviously, Israel negotiates with Hamas, the United States negotiates with Hamas directly. But in terms of actually coordinating with Hamas and saying, okay, aid routes are going to come through here, don't attack that area, make sure that area is clear, the world can do that much more easily with Israel, both legally and also morally. Israel will likely then honor that, or is more likely to honor that, as opposed to Hamas, where there's not supposed to be any communication even, and Hamas doesn't tend to honor that. So from a technical standpoint, it's a lot harder to make these deals with Hamas. At the same time, in terms of the international arena, every time that there is pressure applied to Israel, if you read the fine print of the statements, the pressure is applied to Hamas as well. Similarly, every time there's pressure on Israel to stop the war and withdraw from the Gaza Strip, it also says, and Hamas needs to release all the hostages. So in terms of our international rhetoric, there is pressure that's applied to both sides. But in terms of who is susceptible to international pressure, Israel is a full-fledged actor in the United Nations. It is a close ally of the United States. It has a lot more pressure valves that it relies on international support in order to continue its survival and its economic trade. It has trade deals with the EU and everyone. This is very different. Applying pressure on Hamas is kind of hard to do. It doesn't have the same international trade agreements. It doesn't have a seat in the United Nations. It is already under sanctions from everyone. It's already under bombing from Israel. So it's a lot harder to find those pressure valves and tell Hamas, if you don't do this, then you will fall under sanctions. They're already under sanctions. If you don't do this, then A, B, and C. Israel's facing those things. Hamas, it's a lot harder to do because they already are defined a terror group and are hunted down by a lot of those international actors.
Let's put a button on this. Today does mark 600 days. How would you have reacted back when this war started to hear that this thing would be going on for 600 days and still have no end in sight?
It's a good question. When October 8th, when Israel started its airstrikes in the Gaza Strip and started building up its military, I was asked in a lot of different interviews and in my department, then I was at the University of California, Irvine. I asked, okay, so what's going to happen? What's the end game? I did not foresee it going on this long at this level of intensity, but I said, look, to be blunt, we are probably going to look at 10,000 to 20,000 Palestinians who will be killed. We've more than doubled that by now. We'll probably look at 10,000, 20,000 Palestinians who will be killed. And eventually there's going to be some sort of diplomatic arrangement. The only options here are either Israel retakes the Gaza Strip and has an active occupation going on, in which case the situation just goes down to a slow boil, but continues this level of fighting just at a lower level that is just ongoing. Or there will be some sort of diplomatic resolution. A different government comes into the Gaza Strip, like I said, possibly Palestinian Authority, possibly Egypt, and something will develop. I still think that's the case. I still think those are the only two outcomes. I just did not foresee that it would go on so long without there being that resolution to one direction or another. To some extent, even if Israel were to take over the entire Gaza Strip and have what's called an active occupation, that means that Israel actually assumes responsibility for civil administration, for the banking system, for education system, for rebuilding roads. That's what an occupation is. If Israel were to do that, we would already be looking at a different stage. We wouldn't be looking at these mass bombing campaigns. We would be looking at much more street fighting. We'd be looking at things that are much more resemblant to the West Bank. It's not a good situation. It's not peace. It's also not this level of carnage that's going on all the time. That's still one outcome. The other outcome is some sort of diplomatic resolution. I think that we haven't advanced actually at all from where we were on October 8th in terms of getting us to a resolution. I still think that's going to be one or the other. I just didn't think it would take this long. Unfortunately, one of the things that is going to be one of the main critical factors is the election cycle in Israel. The next elections are due at the end of 2026, but the stability of the government that may fall for a lot of other different internal political reasons is likely to be one of the factors that ends up showing which direction are we going to, the more active occupation or possibly a diplomatic resolution.
Alon, can't thank you enough for being so generous with your time tonight. The always encyclopedic Alon Burstein. Alon, by the way, he's on our air maybe once, twice a week, but if you want more Alon, he has his own YouTube channel. He puts updates kind of like these, but it's just him. There's no me in them. His personal YouTube channel is awesome.
Not
Go give him a subscribe.
fun.
Go ahead.
They're not as fun. They're just me. They're not you.
Yeah, that's one way to put it. If you want to go have fun with only Alon solo, you can go follow him on his YouTube channel. I got to say, thanks for the recap. 600 days, and we'll be talking soon, Alon. Thanks. Have a good night.